Okay. I just wanted to begin briefly with this to emphasize that the poem on the Statue of Liberty doesn't say, oh, all right, if you show up, we'll let you in. It says, send them to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. I welcome them. So this is what my talk will be about today. I'll give examples of specific families' origins of Nobel laureates and an overview, because there just isn't time to talk about every individual one of many Nobel laureates in this time period, 1880 to 1924, families who came in that era, and you'll see why in a minute I picked that time. There are two major points to the talk. One of them is that the immigrant families, many of whom came from very difficult and challenging circumstances, didn't merely make it up to the level of the pre-existing Americans, but they excelled. And the second is when people say, well, why should we pay to educate other people's children? The investment in their education was richly rewarded. So again, I'm going to focus on this period of immigrants, especially the wretched refuse immigrants, the ones who, in today's parlance, wouldn't get any points. They were penniless, they lacked formal education, and they didn't speak English. Between 1880 and 1920, about 20 million immigrants came to the US. Now this slide shows, and it's an interesting article, April 1924 in the New York Times, to read it, the law that changed the fact that up until this time, in spite of criticisms of immigrants, and with the exception of the Chinese Exclusion Act, up until this time, essentially anyone could show up at Ellis Island, said they have a cousin in the Bronx, and be allowed into the country. There wasn't any pre-screening in another country. There weren't any quotas. But here, as you can see, the Republican Congressman Dee Reed from Pennsylvania, he was saying things very similar to what you hear today. You can't build your country with other people's children. These people will never adapt. And so the quotas were established in 1924 to restrict immigration. So for example, before that, about 200,000 Italians a year came to the US. Based on the new quotas, 4,000 a year would be let in. And what the two maps show, the one on the left, in both maps, the darker areas show the flow of immigrants. The one on the left is before the quota law went into effect, and the one on the right is the projected immigration after 1924. And you can see the dramatic decrease in immigration that would be allowed from Eastern and Southern Europe under the quotas. So we have a scientific experiment. These were people who were so disparaged, unwanted, that we actually changed our immigration laws to keep people like them out. So what happened to those families? And I'm not even going to talk about bagels and pizza. So here is an example. Let's look at the family at the bottom. The dad and mom came from Naples. Neither of them even had a first-grade education. And their son, given the opportunities in the United States, became a Nobel laureate in medicine or physiology. So I'm going to focus, we invested in the education and provided opportunity for people who previously would have had no opportunities. I don't have a pointer, but over here on the left is a village in Poland. This is actually just before the Second World War, but many people came from Eastern Europe, from villages like this. The upper right is a village today in Central America where a fellow named Felipe came from. I'll mention him briefly later. Down here is a city college of the City University of New York. At that time, it was free to attend City College, and the City University graduates, out of the City University graduates, 12 have Nobel Prizes in science. And every single one of the City University graduates with a Nobel Prize was either an immigrant or the child of immigrants. So here is one of the City College graduates, little Stanley Cone, got a free education at Brooklyn College. His parents could not have afforded to send him to college. Years later, he discovered epidermal growth factor and its receptor. There are over 12 anti-cancer drugs these days that work through understanding this pathway. In other words, we gave Stanley a free education at Brooklyn College for 4 years, and he has extended and saved. His work built upon his discoveries have extended and saved many lives. Here's another family. Joseph and Lena Kornberg came from what is now Poland. He worked in the sweatshops of the Lower East Side for 30 years in the garment industry and then opened a small hardware store in Brooklyn where his 9-year-old son Arthur helped customers. Little Arthur is Arthur Kornberg, who is a major figure in biomedical science. And by the way, Joseph and Lena's grandsons also have made important contributions to biomedical science. Here are a couple of other families. On the right, you see the Levines. They left Russia in that time period and spoke mostly in Yiddish. And the other family left Poland after a devastating pogrom. And for those who may be unfamiliar with pogroms, that was when people ran through the streets systematically slaughtering Jews. And so many were killed and others left. These families then met in New York. The daughter and son married, and their grandson attended a great New York City school, the Bronx High School of Science, which, by the way, has 8 Nobel laureates from a single high school. As you can imagine, many children of immigrants. And of course, this little boy was our own, Duke's own Bob Lefkowitz, whose Nobel Prize is for helping us to understand how G protein coupled receptors work. And it's worth noting that as of 2 years ago, well over a third of all FDA approved drugs, depending on how you count, it can be even more, work through G protein coupled receptors. So here are more Nobel laureates who are the children of refugees, of the wretched refuse immigrants of that time period. For anyone who knows biochemistry or biology, the list of names is simply stunning. I will point to Howard Temin, who discovered retroviruses and how they work just years before the AIDS epidemic hit, an important discovery that enabled us to understand how to attack that virus. And for North Carolina, many of you may know Trudy Elion, whose work with anti-metabolites of nucleic acids led to important drugs, some of the first effective treatments for leukemia and for HIV. And by the way, I've bolded the New York City public high schools and the New York City University colleges just to emphasize the role of that investment in the education of these so-called wretched refuse immigrants. Here are more children of these refugees and immigrants. I just don't have time to go through, but I wanted to just put them up there. And now the grandchildren. Look at the first one. In addition to his own work discovering that within our own cells there are genes that if you turn them on at an inappropriate time, it can cause a tumor to grow. It also played a major role in scientific institutions, for example, the director of the NIH. Here are more grandchildren. We want to point out, for those of you who may be taking statins, Brown and Goldstein, who worked out the regulation of cholesterol metabolism based upon which the statins were discovered. And one of our new Nobel laureates from just a month ago, Greg Semenza, is also a grandchild of these so-called wretched refuse immigrants. And I'll just put it up there. This is also true for physics Nobel laureates. So just to summarize what I've said so far, for the Nobel laureates in physiology and medicine or chemistry, if you start the clock counting at the time when American science was advanced enough to provide a fertile soil for Nobel quality research, which I took as the date of our first laureate in each of those fields, there were 187 worldwide laureates in physiology or medicine and 154 worldwide in chemistry. So of the 341 laureates in these two fields in the relevant time frame, 34 of them, or 10%, 1 in every 10, was actually a child or a grandchild of this group of immigrants that was so disliked that our immigration laws were changed to keep people like them out of the country. And of course, it's beyond Nobel Prize. Nobel Prizes are a quantifiable measure of scientific achievement, but there were so many others who have contributed at a very high level. In addition to all, as Bob Lefkowitz pointed out, who go to work every day in our labs and build a broad base of scientific knowledge on which a few, the achievements, the noted achievements of a few are based. So both polio vaccines, for example, one from a child of immigrants, the other an immigrant himself. And of course, also an important fact, building scientific enterprises in addition to your own research. So for example, Ralph Snyderman, who is very familiar to you here at Duke, he's the child of parents who fled a pogrom in the Ukraine in 1918, just a few years before our border was closed to people like that. And maybe we should give some points to people who, as Ralph Snyderman said of his own parents, emphasize the importance of learning, integrity, persistence, and striving to do important things. And I want to go back to one of the other grandchildren. Bob Horvitz played a key role in discovering the mechanisms of programmed cell death. Now, you can kill cells by pouring acid on them, of course, but if you want to regulate cell death, it's possible to do that based on his work and others. So you could, and this has broad biomedical importance, because if you turned off cell death, you might be able to protect against neurodegeneration. Or if you turned on or unblocked cell death, you might be able to stop a cancer. Now let's look at his family. All 4 of his grandparents came out of difficult circumstances. And I'm going to focus on his maternal grandmother, who came from Poland. This is her sister, and those are her parents, Bob's great-grandparents. They were all murdered by the Nazis. So this begins to, we know the quality of their grandson and great-grandson. It makes us think, what was lost? What was trapped behind the border when our border began to be closed? The refugees, the people like in Yemen and Syria today, and others who tried to get to a safer place. Those who we lost at our southern border, including Felipe. Yes, these are horrible tragedies for their families. But what about that little girl lying there in the water with her father? What might she or her children or grandchildren have contributed had they just made it a little bit further and been accepted in our country? And so perhaps we can get a hint by some of the people who were trapped on the other side after the law changed, and who, a few of them still managed to get here, and they can be thought of as the voices of those we lost. So the baby at the top in that picture is little Roald Hoffman with his father, who was murdered. Roald was born in 1937 in Poland, not a very comfortable place for a little Jewish baby. His mother and his father arranged for them to manage to escape, but the father didn't make it. Anyone who's taken organic chemistry is familiar with the Woodward-Hoffman rules. He made a major contribution to chemistry. Then I want to talk about the Kindertransport. For those who aren't familiar, as it points out at the bottom, about 10,000 kids were sent from danger, sent by their parents who didn't know if they'd ever see them again, to England to escape the growing storms in Europe. That was 10,000 kids. And one of them was Penzias, who made his way here eventually and won a Nobel Prize in physics for discovering the cosmic background radiation. There were 10,000 kids who were saved through the Kindertransport. Remember, 1.5 million kids didn't make it out and were killed. Look at little Eric Kandel on the right, 3 years old, with his older brother. They managed to come by family reunification now, chain migration, whatever you want to call it. At age 9, after the Nazis had invaded Austria, they made it to New York. Another person who made it out was Mario Capecchi. His mother was arrested when he was a child, and he spent a few years living in the streets of Italy. I don't have a picture of Mario in the streets of Italy, so I used a picture of some children living in the streets of Yemen today. Mario's mother found him deathly ill in a hospital after the war. They managed to come here, and he too won a Nobel Prize. And I'll talk about one more, the St. Louis. This is a boat full of refugees that came to our shore seeking sanctuary from the Nazis and were turned back and sent back to Europe. 40% of the people on that boat died in the Second War. But one who survived was Arno Matulski, who eventually made it here, and sort of as the voice of what was lost, he played a major role in medical genetics and pharmacogenetics. So it's not just the Nobel laureates from these families. There are broad contributions to science, medicine, and education, and of course, ongoing contributions by immigrant and refugee families from other eras. I want to talk about this one family from that wretched refuse era. Morris over here came as an unaccompanied teenager after he woke up in a morgue, having been left for dead in the streets during a pogrom in the Ukraine. Rose and her parents fled Poland after the Polish army came to try to kidnap her 9-year-old brother, who was hiding under a mattress that they ran the bayonet through, but fortunately missed her brother. When they arrived, they met here. He fought for the United States in World War I. In the bottom picture, it's a little fuzzy, but he's in the middle, in the trench there where he was gassed. In World War II, they both volunteered to be air raid wardens in case they had to enforce a blackout in New York City. Their older daughter is there as a nurse. They're a nursing student. She became a public health nurse with a man in an iron lung. And their grandchildren, one of them is an assistant dean of science at a community college in Virginia and a professor of biology. And their other grandchild is shown there graduating from Brooklyn College with a degree in chemistry and is standing before you right now, today. So these families contributed broadly in many ways to their communities and were devoted to America. And I want to tell you one more story of an immigrant today, Gabriela. This excellent book by Jeff Merkley, a senator from Oregon, who met her as she was waiting on this side of the border for asylum. She had left El Salvador after they threatened to kill her. She was 8 months pregnant because her family hadn't repaid a loan. After she left, they killed her uncle instead. She presented herself at the border for asylum, but was blocked on the footbridge by guards standing in the way that kept sending her back with her infant to Mexico. But she saw there was another bridge with cars going across it. And she saw that there were people cleaning the windows of those cars as they waited on the bridge. So with her infant in her arms, she borrowed a squeegee and squeegeed her way across the US border. Don't we want women like Gabriela creative, innovative, persistent in our country. And in fact, Greg Semenza said of his own immigrant, 14-year-old grandmother and great-grandparents, it was their courage in seeking a better life in America that made my life and accomplishments possible. So this is what I've said. There isn't really time to go review it, but I just want to emphasize the fact that discovery comes from people who reach for something better rather than sit around and complain. And these families are certainly enriched with people like that. I want to also mention this link, the C-SPAN. This is 8 hours of Nancy Pelosi recounting mini biographies of dreamer after dreamer after dreamer and all their accomplishments today. So they're still coming. They're still coming, as you know, because you know dreamers in your lives and other immigrants. And I want to end with this quote from this excellent book. More than anything else, the immigrants come with dreams. Thank you to all the immigrants for your dreams.